Dan Hooker, somehow. I mean, if you want to talk about the grittiest performance over the weekend, Drake has had a nice one. I think Dan Hooker had a better one in terms of the grittiness of it. He turned back the clock and beat a smothering Mateusz Gamrot. Okay. A, how surprising was this? And B, this is probably going to push him at or close to the top 5. What fight makes the most sense? Let's talk about the fight in just a minute.
Okay.
Your reaction to him beating a guy that most of us thought was like not even remotely possible.
I can't even begin to understand his kind of resurrection on the side because he lost those 4 out of 5. And it was, we've seen this kind of thing before with fighters who are pretty good, maybe not great, but very good, put on a show, and then they start losing fights. And you're like, well, this is kind of how they spiral out. Eventually he'll just be out of the UFC. It's like one of those type of things. I admit, I buried him. I was like, I thought he was on that track. You know, you lose this 4 out of 5. There are very good fighters he was losing to. All of them are like huge names, you know, Islam, Poirier, you know, those types of names. But to resurrect was one thing. So kind of win a couple fights. Okay, that's one thing. It was a nice thing. It put him back into a spot like this. But I thought this is where all of any renewed hype goes to die. You fight a guy like Gamrot, he kind of fits the trajectory of the guys who'd already beat Hooker, right? Like once he meets those guys at that level, they usually beat him. So I was kind of, if I had to have picked a lock on this card, I was going to pick Gamrot. I thought that he was that good. I thought his style would overwhelm Hooker, and it just didn't happen, man. And it was kind of shocking. I think the way the fight went down, though, it's almost Poirier-esque against Benoit Saint-Denis in the sense that, you know, it looks like it's going one way, and then it starts to turn. You're like, is Hooker in this fight? You know, you're like kind of wondering, is he going to be able to turn this around? He has that moment in between rounds where he's just like laughing and bleeding and saying, I love this shit, or whatever he's saying. I mean, it's kind of an iconic turn, isn't it? And then he wins the fight. It's funny that in a space of 15 minutes, you can achieve a kind of cult status again, maybe higher than he ever has in the UFC.
I think that's so well stated. And also for me, it's like, dude, remember, he had more than this, but he's had at least 2 fights that were brutal.
Oh, yeah.
So the Dustin Poirier fight was brutal. The Edson Barboza beating, people forget that. You had Daniel Cormier, I believe, commentating that fight, begging the referee on air to stop it.
I remember that, yeah.
Because he was getting crushed. And for him to still be relevant, by the way, not just beating a tough guy, but this whole time he was like, put whoever you want in there. Anybody. I just want to be on this card. These are like a guy who's long in the tooth.
I mean, they were trying to kill him off in that sense, right?
The guy who's long in the tooth, who's had some bad beatings, so you kind of feel like, well, we know his level, it's good, but you know, it's got some limits. And then I'll take a fight on short notice. And then you're fighting a guy who's like the king of smothering, and you fucking win? It's like, oh my God, how is this even possible? I will also say, though,
you didn't have a problem though with the decision, like in terms of like, did you think Gamrot won? I know some people thought he did, but
listen, this is a very close fight.
Yeah.
I think you could have had it either way. I kind of leaned a little bit more Gamrot, but I really have zero issue.
That's the way I
zero
felt.
issue.
Exactly the same thing.
I have no problem whatsoever at all with the way it was run. And also, like, you know, the judging in there, Ben Cartilage was one of the judges. I think he's one of the best ones in the world, if not the best. And, you know, if you just look at his body of work, it's pretty clear that he's going to value any kind of striking damage or meaningful grappling more than just control time. But it also kind of gets to another part of the story, Chuck, which is Mateusz Gamrot has had a lot of these kinds of fights where he got beat up more in this one, although his hands look pretty good too, I thought.
Yeah, he did.
But he's had a lot of these ones where he like kind of eked it out or was just a little bit ahead because he's a very, very dynamic wrestler. But, you know, I'm not going to say he got his comeuppance. That's not the right word. But he might have been due for one. And I want to point out something, too. Hooker going for those guillotine chokes, forcing him to go back down. He didn't out-wrestle Gamrot, but he definitely out-techniqued him. Right. He definitely had a better answer that speaks to the judges, that forces a reaction. Like, I mean, the judging was close, or the scoring was going to be close, but Gamrot has been kind of playing with fire. Finally, you got a guy who doesn't give a fuck at all and is clever. He had clever answers. This is not the first time we've ever seen them in MMA, but as applied to Gamrot, and he didn't really have an answer for it.
So weird, man, because Gamrot, if you'd said, and I mean, and most predicted that he was going to win this fight. He was a huge betting favorite. But if you'd seen the first round, and you see Gamrot get up on the scorecards essentially, you'd be like, this is going to just follow a pattern almost, because he's that kind of fighter. He may not finish you, but he's just going to do the same thing. He's just going to eke out the rounds like you're mentioning. He'll be 30-27. It's kind of crazy that he wasn't able to do that. Like, he was just prevented from doing that. Plus, that crowd was nuts, man. Like, it looked very strange. It looked smaller, like that arena, but when he was fighting, every single time Hooker would throw, it was just like cacophony. It was like, boom. They was just, loud, and I was like, this is nuts, man. So it must have been like a little bit of a Hitchcockian vertigo moment for Gamrot, because I think it started going south and he didn't know what to do with it. Like, he just kind of tried to persevere. He probably thought he had it, but in the end, man, it's just that's how it goes, right? Like, a close fight, it goes either way.
All right, so who does he fight next? There have been a couple of names suggested. The big one was Charles Oliveira. You could do Dan Hooker versus Charles Oliveira. I'll say this. He had kind of indicated in an interview with Oscar Willis from the Mac Life that there's going to be a Sydney card in February. So potentially he'll be back on there. So you have to ask yourself, who is willing to travel to Sydney to fight Dan Hooker? I don't know the answer to that.
It would have to be somebody under him then, I would think, in the rankings.
Maybe. It would depend. But I'll tell you what, you could do – this is the interesting part. He had kind of faded outside of the top, I think certainly top 5. Where's he ranked right now? So Dan Hooker currently sits, as it stands this moment, Dan Hooker is sitting at number 11. So he's fallen outside the top 10.
As of tomorrow, though, they'll update that. I think because
this is the number as of still Friday, essentially. But he's going to be back either at 5 or pretty close to it. Well, now you're around the Chandlers and you're around the Poiriers.
Right.
So you could do Poirier again. You could do Oliveira. Here's my vote. Dan Hooker, Justin Gaethje.
I saw you say this.
Yeah, where are you on this?
I love that fight because I think Justin Gaethje's at a part in his career that's sort of the same way. Like, so that, I mean, obviously, like, you're looking at two guys who think differently, like, right? Just put them in front of me, let's go. I think they would accommodate each other 100%, like Gaethje does with everybody. And I think that's a great Hooker fight, like, too. Like, I think that it would make a lot of sense. He seems so open to it. I'm like, I was thinking about this, man. I was like, he really does fit the bill of like the BMF, like whatever that is, right? Like, you're like the BMF when you talk about that, he kind of fits the bill because he's just put me in there I'll go to war, get me bleeding, get my hair pink, with his new hair. It's like any of this stuff. Like, I feel like he's that guy. So they could plug him into a situation like that. I'd be fine with it. But he mentioned, and I was like, everybody always mentions Conor McGregor, but I'm like, if let's say that he like either he fights Michael Chandler, because Michael Chandler's kind of left on this endless loop of waiting for McGregor. That could work. But if he was going to somehow get that McGregor fight, I could see why this would be an appealing fight for Conor McGregor. It's a guy who will stand and trade with him and maybe play to his strengths a little bit more than like maybe Chandler, maybe. But I'm like, I feel like Dan Hooker's kind of got it. He's in that weird space now because he put on such an iconic performance here that all of them sound good, right? I think I would go with Gaethje ultimately. If I was choosing, I'd probably go with Gaethje. I just think that that's like can't miss fight. Like, that'd be a can't miss action fight.
There's no wrong answer.
That's true.
It's just a function of what the UFC wants to do with those guys on what dates for what purpose. But you literally cannot go wrong with any of them.
Yeah, and I think that we've seen a little bit of it this year. Like, guys, you were mentioning. This was before we were taping, but we were talking about like, what are you going to do with Izzy next? And you're like, well, do you put him in like against a guy like Bo Nickel, like make him like the guy who becomes like the stepping, you're a stepping stone for this other guy to get up there. I feel like they've tried to do this, like Benoit Saint Denis with Dustin Poirier. They're kind of a little bit maybe with this Gamrot, like, well, let's give him a guy here he can get through, and then we'll talk about the more serious fight, And it keeps backfiring, man. It's unusual. Isn't it? Like, it's unusual that these veterans are sort of like, nope, I'm going to draw on the line in the sand, and they're winning these fights. So we've seen it a few times this year. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Like, so I feel like it's he's kind of in a great spot for that. I think once you go through the moment they're trying to kind of like feed you to somebody, and you beat that guy, it puts you in a great spot. So if I heard that, I think somebody had mentioned that Dana was looking at Charles Oliveira. If that's the case, you're kind of giving him an upward trajectory, even if he's at 5 or 6. You're still fighting a guy now who's 2 or 3.
Yeah.
So if he wants that, if he's interested in that, that's a great fight.
If he beats Charles Oliveira, how far are you away from a title shot?
You would have to be right there, right? Which is just That would be mind-blowing.
Unthinkable on Friday. Unthinkable that Dan Hooker would ever be in a position like that.
After he lost 4 out of 5, if you said, hey, if he's 4 fights away from a title shot, he's just going to win all these fights, that would be ridiculous. Nobody would believe that. That would be impossible.
And yet, here we are.
I know.
He spoke to Daniel Cormier after the fight, and he is jazzed up about what he wants next. This is what he said.
Dan, you're going to be in the top 5. That was a big victory. What do you want next?
Look at me now. I want them all, brother. I want the BMF. I want Conor McGregor. I want a title eliminator. I want everything, brother. I want it all, Sean. I want it all, Hunter.
What a phenomenal performance. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for the Hangman, Dan Hooker.
That's as high as you can be on drugs without being high on drugs. You know what I mean?
100%.
Your brain chemistry is just being tsunamied by adrenaline, and that's what you're seeing right there.
But dude, I don't know how he keeps that going. Like, his whole face is swollen, his eyes are swollen shut. You know, he's bleeding, and I mean, he was even doing that between the rounds. It's crazy, man. If ever there's a guy, like, there are certain guys in the sport who communicate the high of cage fighting or just fighting in general in a way that others can't. That's what happened.
Speaking of which, this is him between rounds. That moment he was like,
okay.
I love this shit,
is
brother.
great. This is great.
Let's see it.
I love it. Let's go.
That's wild.
I mean, if he doesn't go into sports, that's a guy. Like, I'm not saying he is a bad guy. I'm saying if he wanted to be a serial killer, he's got some of the makeup for it. You know what I mean?
Man. You imagine getting into like a bar scrap sometimes, and you see some sadistic son of a bitch like who's smiling after you hit him with everything you have. I would be like, why? Well, out of all the guys you could fight, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, there are some people who just love it. They just love it.
Tells you how hard Michael Chandler hit him because it kind of folded him in that way, and that like normally even Edson Barboza had to kind of beat him accumulatively. You know what I mean? Poirier too. Poirier had to beat him up accumulatively.
It's crazy with these guys too, man. Like you mentioned Barboza. I think that sometimes you look at these, like, Barboza's been in a ton of wars, you know, like,
and he just beat Sadiq Youssef. You can't even believe it.
I know, and it's like you see these guys, and there's so many wars, and we've talked about the old welterweight division where the buzzsaw that was Robbie Lawler and how they were just altering each other's lives. So every time somebody fought, you know, Johnny Hendricks would get up there, whoever it is, and they would just come out in a different form. Rory McDonald was never the same, you know, after these things. But I feel like some of these guys, like in this lightweight division, are like this. They're just beating each other to pulps and loving it and doing it again and again. It's just crazy, man. I don't think we've ever seen this level of destruction within the division.
I don't. On the one hand, I am quite worried about his long-term health. On the other hand, it's like very few guys embody Warhorse better than Dan Hooker.
Yeah.
You know, that's pretty remarkable. From the Gibsonator, this will go to you first, Chuck Mindenhall. Should the next fight for Dan Hooker be a BM? That's a great question. We didn't even get to this.
Wow.
Should it be a BMF fight against Max, win or lose against Ilia? So let's reference. Let's posit he loses to Ilia. It's not some brutal destruction. Okay. He can kind of make a reasonable turnaround. Would that make sense for you?
I think so, because where would Max be at that point? You know. And I'm like, if Max is like, I don't think the BMF title is on the line for this fight with Ilia, right? Like, I don't even know how they're doing this. I know that
I don't believe that they have said it is.
Okay. Well, whatever the case is, I think Max doesn't have an obvious next move, and he kind of enters that weird space where you're like, maybe he's not all about titles anymore after you've lost this other fight. He's already kind of been there, done that. I wouldn't mind seeing it. I mean, it's like that's a fun fight to me. After watching what Holloway did with Gaethje in the other cult-making fight of the year, even though the cult of Max was already strong, I just think that solidified his thing when he's like, let's do this right here, knocks him out with seconds to go. I think that they kind of have parallels in that way. You know, they kind of have like this strange, like there's something transcendent about that attitude that would match in the BMF sort of thing. And if you're trying to really create an idea of what the BMF is, not just throwing guys in there who are like, oh, he doesn't care, he's a reprobate or whatever, like, or he's nuts, this would actually make sense to me. You know, it's like you got two guys who they really are kind of the baddest motherfuckers, aren't they? Like, so I think that would be fun.
I don't need to see Hooker in a BMF fight. Like, for me, it feels a little like.
Do you even like the BMF concept at all? I feel like it's some people like it. And some are...
I would say this, like, obviously by itself. I mean, okay, if you watch combat sports long enough, and this is obvious to people right away, but sometimes it's not. what you really realize over time is the title does not make the fighter
Right.
makes the title. And I feel like after what Max did to Justin, he made that title matter a little bit.
Right.
So I do think it matters a little
Okay.
bit. But I don't view it as a trinket, but I don't view it as a weight class
got you.
title. You know what I mean?
Yep.
It's valuable in some kind of capacity.